I have two more techniques that I want to show you. For the next one, need to get another, I call these my ink palettes here. Just my own personal terminology. I call it a palette because I'm building up ink just as if I was pouring paint out of a tube or ink out of a bottle. I'm just getting a spot here on the paper that I can use. And then I want to put just a little bit of water in here just to get it wet, get a nice bubble of water on that page. And I think I'll use my medium brush to do this. And I dip my brush in there, and this is a well-known technique in art media and in drawing. You can do splatters. We all love our splatters. How fun is that? So you can use these R2 pens not only to draw lines, but you can use them to do a lot of different drawing techniques. Simply because that ink is water soluble. Look at that. Lots of splatter. So I'm going to blot this off. I don't want it to smudge my next page. I'm going to write splatter here. Then the last technique that I want to show you, let's do it right over on this page. Here again, I'm just going to build up my palette here. I want a nice juicy ink spot to work from. And I'm just doing this spot on the paper for demo. If I was actually doing it on a page, I would probably do it over on another sheet of paper. I wouldn't put this ink spot on the same page as I'm doing my sketch or drawing. I'm going to give myself lots of ink here to work from. And put some water on it, get it nice and juicy. I'm going to start out using my small brush just for demonstration, and I'm going to put some dots on the page, almost as if I splattered it. Just put them in the background. And dots just more for the shape than anything. I'm just filling it in. You'll see why in a minute. So I'm doing a layering technique. This is the first layer. I'm just calling the first layer my dots. And let's see. I guess that's almost good enough. We'll put some more down here in the corner. Okay, now I'm going to dry this. I want to keep my hot air from going over on that side of the paper. I want this ink to dry. So I'm just going to hit it with my heat gun. That's pretty good. Now, the next layer, I'm going to do lines, and I'm going to do them with my medium brush. I'm going to add some lines. I want some of those lines to go over my dots. Let's put some more water on there. It's got plenty of ink. It's just water soaking through the page there. Okay, just make some fast lines across the page. That's good. Those are pretty good lines. Let's do some down this way. That's my second layer, the lines. Now, let's put some more water on this. I'm going to go back to my medium brush again. And I'm going to do 2 circles here. Just painting them in. Let's overlap them just a little. Spot of ink while that is drying. Let's spritz it. I want to put another. Just kind of paint this in. Okay, let's dry this. Make sure it's nice and dry. A little more water down here. Then I'm going to go to my big brush. Get it nice and juicy. Let's draw a square. And let's do a square here. Let's try this. What I wanted to show you on this example, I'm calling this overlapping and layering. Those first dots that I put on the first layer, you can still see them. Once they're dry, they do not move. So when I did the other layers, you can see the dots showing through. You can see the circles showing through. You can see the lines showing through. So this ink has a permanency to it as you're building up your layers. And as you're overlapping areas, you can see on this circle, you can see the lines, you can see some of the first dots, you can see this side of the square, you can see the circle, you can see where the other circle overlaps it. So this technique I'm calling layering and overlapping. That's the last technique that I wanted to illustrate. Boy, you can do a lot with these R2 pens, or with any pen that has a nice water-soluble ink to them. I like the R2 pens because they're $2 for $1. Hey, let's just review what I've covered. I've done the pen comparisons, The Ink R2, the Vision pen, both gave nice spots of water to work with tonal values. The Ink Precision pen has a little bit finer point than the R2, but I still get a nice flow of ink out of it. The Hotel ballpoint pen, not so much. But that's really, it's a disadvantage for this technique, but it can be an advantage if you're working for permanency, if you want a permanent layer and you're putting water on your page. That can be an advantage. You just don't get the nice flow of ink. Same thing with the fine point Sharpie. You get some flow of ink, you get some tonal value, but not as much. And that can be an advantage if you're looking for something more permanent. Then we did this demo of an ink palette. I showed you how I build up a palette and use that ink to transfer from my palette to different areas of the page and build up tones. This was the wet palette. Ignore this ink here because it bled over from this demo, but in here I just had a spritz of nothing but water, and I'm calling that my wet palette. This actually is a wet palette. This is a wet palette with ink, and this is just a plain wet palette with nothing in it. And we went to the lines demo where we did the uncontrolled bleed, where we just spritz it and water went every place. Gives a nice effect. There's nothing wrong with that effect. But if you want something more controlled, you build your wet palette here and you dip your brush in your water and you have more control if you apply the water with a brush. You don't get that uncontrolled water causes the ink to go everywhere and anywhere. Then we looked at the tonal studies, how we created a very, very light tone by putting just a light brush, one layer of ink, and then blotting it up right away. Get very, very light, and then medium tones, a little bit darker, and darker yet by applying layers of ink, letting it dry, putting another layer on, letting it dry, put another layer on. Here we looked at some things that don't work as well. If you're doing a face, you don't want to just spritz your water or any liquid medium on it because you get that uncontrolled bleed and your lines will not be as defined on your face. In some instances you may want that. It depends on what you're going for, but generally if you're doing a face and you want to soften those ink lines, use a brush and then you can control that bleed and you don't get squiggly lines on your face. The other thing that doesn't work well is drawing directly in a puddle of water. It will not draw. But I am able to get the ink to flow again. However, if you put a puddle of water down on the paper and blot it up with your towel and then draw on a damp area of your page, that does work. You can see that here. Drawing on wax paper does not work. It's wax paper. Drawing on wax with ink, there's nothing on it that works. We looked at the different types of paper. The best papers that work for this technique are vellum-coated papers. Bristol paper might work well. I don't have Bristol paper at hand, but that might work well. You want a coated paper. Watercolor paper works well. Sketchbook paper, not so good. Any paper that does not have a coating on it, the paper absorbs the ink and it does not bleed out or give you that nice flow of ink like what we're going for here. I did not test with copy paper, but I would imagine it would be similar to sketchbook paper. We tried some monoprinting and blotting. I found that the monoprints blur. I don't get a good monoprint when I try to monoprint on the other side of this. However, if I just blot it out, I do like the blot. This is more of a blot. Here we tested writing with it and then spritzing it, you get a nice tonal value over your letters, which is nice. It gives a dark area in the background. But if you want to go more for shadowing of your letters, here again, take your brush and do the controlled bleed by dipping your brush in a wet palette and going over each of your letters that way and moving the ink and creating that nice shadow. Here we put down some craft paint and wrote into the craft paint. You want to be sure that your craft paint or your acrylic paint is dry before you do that. Here it was still damp and it got scratchy. And if you get your paint too thick, especially with craft paint, it can get scratchy. But if you get a nice thin layer of paint, it writes over it very nice. Of course, it writes on dry paper just fine. However, the caveat to that is if you get it wet, it will blur if you're using a vellum coated paper. So if you're working on putting journaling on your sketchbook, say you're out doing urban sketching, you want to journal it and you use your pen to journal it, you want to be careful if you want a nice clean journaling spot not to get that too wet. You might take along a little workable fixative after you're finished and spray just your journaling. I talked a little bit about the food ball pen. I find that these Ink R2 roller ball pens, the .07, work very similar to the food ball pens. I would just as soon buy two for $1 as to pay $3 for a food ball pen. Food ball pens are sold as pens that generally write over most anything. We talked about working over a gel medium. I did not demonstrate it here, but I have tried it and it does work. One of the advantages of working over a gel medium or any type of an uncoated gesso, any type of a layering on your paper is once you put those marks down, if you don't like what you're doing, then you can take an alcohol and pretty easily wipe it away. Then we talked about nice splatter, getting splatter on your page. This is very much a drawing technique, but you can achieve it with these R2 pens. And the last thing we talked about was layering and overlapping, where you can create a bottom layer and it still has a permanency to the layers on top of it. And I imagine if you put in a drawing line here and went over it with a watercolor type thing, that would show through. So those are the things that I found very interesting when I was exploring these R2 pens. I find them very fun to work with, very fun to try all these different techniques, very fun when I go out urban sketching, very fun when I'm just sitting at my desk playing with drawing faces or whatever I'm doing in my art journaling. So I hope this little chat and review has been informative, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. And I will see you on the next page.